Okay, yeah.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Yeah, so hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So good to see you. Really excited about today's session of the academic reading group. We have our speaker. I'm inclined to pronounce your name the German way.
It's a Polish name, so you can go ahead and do that. That's fine.
I would in German, I would say Julia Berger, but I'm not sure. How would you say that in English? Do you say Julia Berger?
Well, so I'm Polish, so my given name is Julia, but Julia is fine. Julia Berger is fine.
Okay, all right. So yeah, Julia is our speaker, and she is affiliated with the Montclair State University in the US. She is going to speak about the topic of the Baha'i international community and the United Nations. We then have our respondent, Mr. Hyder, who also does really exciting research. Maybe one day we'll also get to hear about your research, Misbah. Or maybe you'll manage to bring it in a little bit in your response. Because Julia, she works on Ahmadiyya community.
I know.
Yeah, so that might actually be quite interesting to hear about Misbah's thoughts and reflections on Julia's work with regards to our own research. But no pressure, Misbah, you give your response in whatever way you see fit. We're going to have around 25 minutes for Julia to speak about her book and her research. And then after that, I think we said 10 minutes for Misbah to respond to that. After that, we will have some time for discussion. You can ask questions or make comments, bring in your own experience. And we'll finish an hour after we started. So that's 3 o'clock in the UK, 4 o'clock in Central Europe, and 10 a.m. on the US East Coast. And the rest of you, please just figure it out yourself, because that's too much mental mass for me on a Thursday afternoon, my time. Yeah, and I'll stop my rambling now and hand over to Julia. We're really excited to hear about your research, Julia.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me, and a big thank you to Misbah for who I had a chance to meet a couple of weeks ago, and discovered all sorts of interests that we have in common. So I'm excited to be in conversation with her and to be here. All right, 25 minutes. This is possible. So the title of my presentation is Ideas, Religion, and Social Change. The Baha'i International Community and the United Nations. But the focus of the presentation is really one part of this book, which focuses specifically, the part that I'm going to focus on today focuses specifically on conceptions of peace, and looking at how ideas and approaches that emerge from within a religious revelation, from within a religious community, are then applied to this construct and yield a new and different and compelling construct for peace. So by way of a little bit of context, this research begins really in 2001 with an internship that I was fortunate to have at the Baha'i International Community's UN office. And I remember very distinctly feeling so intrigued, even in my first couple of weeks there, just trying to understand why the UN was even taking religious organizations seriously, and how it is that religious organizations were accorded these privileges to be present in many of the spaces at the UN. And then later going deeper into the internship and continuing my research about this, really starting to see that the way that that religion and politics were being conceived within the Baha'i community was really not at all reflected in the literature. There was something new, there were new concepts which had not yet been written about, and that were really potentially going to stretch the imagination of how we thought about what religion represents, and what a religious actor is in thinking about the modern world, and also thinking about the polity and politics as an activity aimed at social transformation in general. So after that internship, fast forward 15, 16 years, when I was doing my doctorate, I decided to really try to delve into this 75-year case study of this long relationship that the Baha'i community had had with the UN, and try to understand how do some of the concepts emerging from the Baha'i faith really shape a very distinct form of engagement. So I'm going to share my screen and share some of these insights. Hopefully you could see my screen now. Okay. So a little bit broader than the question of peace, which we're going to be focusing on, are these 4 questions that connect this discourse to a broader discourse about religion and modernity that I think it's also important to keep in our minds. And the 4 questions, the first has to do with reimagining modernity as a whole and thinking about what is the role of religion today as the world is really in the process of rethinking much of its institutions and processes, and what we're going to need to survive and thrive in the coming decades and centuries ahead. The second is a question of agency. Who are the protagonists of the emerging social order? It speaks for itself. The third question has to do beyond economic man. What values are going to foster justice and human flourishing in our time? We know that the economic and capitalist imperatives are very much intertwined with almost every facet of human life and human processes today. And so what are going to be the values that will enable us to create systems that truly address human needs and enable human flourishing at all levels? And finally, from aspirations to action, how then, in a very practical sense, can we collectively translate ideals into actions in continually changing socioeconomic circumstances? So a brief word about the Baha'i International Community, which is the protagonist that we are looking at in this presentation. So the BIC, as it's known as an acronym, is the formal representation of the worldwide Baha'i community to the UN. It collaborates with various UN agencies, and it's really a family of offices that work with different non-governmental, intergovernmental organizations, academia, and you could see the 5 offices there in the map below. The presentation today will focus primarily on the New York office, which works primarily with the United Nations. So the Baha'i International Community doesn't emerge out of the blue at the UN. Actually, there's already a long history before the founding of the United Nations, almost exactly 100 years of early engagement with the leaders of thought and political leaders of the day, in which the Baha'i community is contributing its ideas and its vision very actively. So the founder of the Baha'i faith, Baha'u'llah, in the 1860s and 70s writes letters, or what are called tablets in the Baha'i faith, tablets to the kings and rulers, addressing questions of justice, urging them to abolish slavery, to disarm, to eradicate corruption, etc. Then in the 20th century, Abdul Baha, the eldest son of Baha'u'llah, who is the appointed leader, the Baha'i community after the passing of Baha'u'llah, carries messages of peace and solidarity to the West, and is very much a part of the conversation about laying the groundwork for an international peace. And we see him urging people to consider, for example, religious, racial, political, economic, and patriotic prejudices, and how they undermine the basis for progress and peace. And then finally, in the early 20th century, Shoghi Effendi, who then becomes the appointed leader of the Baha'i community after the passing of Abdul Baha, then guides the Baha'i community's engagement, first with the League of Nations in 1925, and then with the United Nations. So this is just to say that there's already a path, there's an ethic, there's a vision, and the creation of the United Nations creates a new possibility, a new setting, a new kind of conversation for not only the Baha'i International Community, but many other civil society organizations to now be part of this global conversation. So as I looked at this history, the 75-year history of the Baha'i community's engagement, I was really trying to identify what one might call a conceptual DNA, or a conceptual framework underpinning the kinds of behaviors and decisions and priorities and approaches that really made the Baha'i community's approach different and really worthy of closer study. So the three elements I looked at specifically were a particular view of history. So the Baha'i community has a developmental view of history, which is to say that it sees humanity as having passed through what might be thought of as developmental stages of the collective childhood of humanity, and today finds itself at the threshold of its maturity. Maturity being understood as the capacity for action at a planetary level. So there's this rising potential and capacity for people to work together across national divides, and we're at the stage where that capacity is growing, and you can say that we are beginning to reach a stage of maturity in our ability to act collectively. I'm just going through these, quite quickly so I could get to the peace section. The second element, the second conceptual thread is the principle of the oneness of humanity, which is also really at the heart of all Baha'i teachings. And this is a principle that concerns itself with what are referred to as the essential relationships that make up the social order. These include relationships within the family, among men and women, between human beings and the environment, also relationships between the governors, the elected leaders of society, and the electors, economic relationships, etc. So all of these relationships, which are part of the social order, are then essential to moving towards the vision of humanity that is deeply kind of interdependent in a very functional and thriving way. And finally, I look at the administrative order, which is the governing and legislative structures in the Baha'i community at the local, national, and international level that are envisioned and described in the writings of the Baha'i faith itself. So, moving now to the focus on peace. So, just briefly, you could see here actually the story of the Baha'i International, or the study of the Baha'i International community's engagement with the UN is broken up into 4 historical periods. And the period we're focusing on today is the third period, which is here, the period between 1986 and 2008, though I will speak beyond 2008. And this is the period during which a focus on peace really becomes the central orienting focus of its work. So interestingly, as some scholars have noted, the idea of peace is widely referred to, but seldom defined. And it's very easy to assume that organizations working towards peace all have the same, perhaps have the same ends and conditions in mind, or to assume that civil society organizations, whether religious or secular, hold the same idea of peace as perhaps is embodied in the UN Charter. And certainly there is much in common, but we shouldn't assume that it's a monolithic concept in any way. So, of course, the idea of peace emerges from different intellectual and philosophical traditions, each of which define it a little bit differently, and which identify particular qualities of this kind of desired state of social affairs. Embodied within the ideas of peace are, for example, assumptions about the nature of the human being, the sources of conflict, the means for achieving peace, the requisite conditions for human flourishing. So again, it's important to be aware that the different theological traditions and different philosophical traditions are going to have contributions to make as to thinking about the structure of peace. So the idea of peace itself, even within the international order and within the context of the UN, has itself continued to evolve as the UN machinery has been tested through different kinds of challenges. So this slide, without going into detail, it just demonstrates that, you know, we begin in 1945 with the charter, which opens with the words, "We, the peoples of the UN, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war," etc., come together in the name of creating an organization to protect the peace. And so the peace that's noted there is often understood as a liberal peace, an institutional peace that provides governance and guarantees and provides and ensures democracy and civil peace and freedom and rights within society. But then as we as the UN progresses, there are new agendas that are introduced, new concepts. There's an expansion of the concept of peace. A wider range of issues is acknowledged as being part of the peace and security nexus. So poverty, environmental degradation, the spread of organized crime, all of these are gradually factored into how the UN thinks about peace. And then most recently in 2020, the UN releases what is called our common agenda, in which again it conveys its orientation towards peace. So this is just to say that this is the institutional and kind of intellectual context in which this work unfolds. So we see in 1986, for the first time, the international governing body of the worldwide Baha'i community issues a statement to the peoples of the world, and it is a statement concerning peace. 1986, the UN designates as the International Year of Peace, so it coincides with this international year. And the statement states that, the statement from the Baha'i community, that permanent peace among the nations is an essential stage, but not, as Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, asserts, the ultimate goal of the social development of humanity. Beyond the initial armistice forced upon the world by the fear of nuclear holocaust, beyond the political peace recently entered into by suspicious rival nations, beyond pragmatic arrangements for security and coexistence, lies the crowning goal, the unification of all the peoples of the world in one universal family. So I lift out this particular excerpt from the statement because in effect, the statement is introducing a new narrative of social progress. Whereas very often such a narrative might envision peace as an end stage in a developmental trajectory, here the goal is really redefined, and it is reconstructed along a continuum of progress, which moves towards increasing spheres of unity and drawing closer to what is called the crowning goal, which is the unification of the peoples of the world in one universal family. So this is actually a concept that is extensively developed in the Baha'i writings. I like to say that it's not a kumbaya moment where we just think, now there's peace and we all get along, but it goes much deeper than that to really address some of the institutional, psychological, cultural dimensions. And so we see here, one way of thinking about this is some of the different elements of the Baha'i conception of peace, which is described in many other writings of the Baha'i community. So one is this question of identity, which is how do we understand who we are as human beings and our relationship and responsibilities towards one another. So this particular conception of peace focuses on a sense of belonging to and a concern for the well-being of the human race. So while we can hold many other identities as we do as complex human beings, the overarching identity is one of membership in the human race and responsibility and concern for that. Another is diversity, a diversity rooted in the diversity of culture, climate, history, language, and thought. So when we think about unity, it is not a unity defined by uniformity, but rather in the richness of our diversity. Another element is the question of coherence, which is that the means of pursuing peace must be coherent with the ends. And therefore, if we are looking to work towards greater capacity for collective action and solidarity, the means that we use must also not allow us to be partisan, or in any way separating people into factions which are working against one another. Then moving to the top right, the question of unification. So what are the different elements that need to work towards greater coherence and unity? So we're thinking here about political machinery, trade, finance, a script, language, and spiritual aspiration. So these are terms also taken from the Baha'i writings. We can go more into it later. There's, of course, the dimension of institutional reform. And I'm just going to highlight here a reform that both avoids excessive centralization and excessive uniformity. So looking at the evolution of structures, of administrative structures, and then finally, a question of protagonists. So who is going to bear what kinds of responsibilities for enacting this peace? And we speak here about individuals, communities, as well as institutions, all having complementary and distinct roles. So again, as we are thinking about this collective development of humanity, moving from our collective childhood into sort of being on the threshold of maturity, we think about the increasing capacity for the nations to come together and peacefully deliberate on matters of shared concern. And so during this particular period of time, which I'm addressing in the book, so 1986 to 2008, we see a succession of UN conferences, which for the first time are bringing together increasingly large numbers of heads of state to deliberate on urgent issues. So I've included here a photo from the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 with 172 nations generating Agenda 21 for the work towards environmental sustainability. We see on the bottom left the historic UN Fourth World Conference on Women, which brought together 189 countries, 30,000 women, so record numbers of heads of state and civil society representatives, again, demonstrating kind of a collective shared focus on particular issues facing humankind. And on the bottom right, also around the same time, the UN World Summit for Social Development in 1995. So again, I think we can look at these gatherings from a critical lens in terms of what did they accomplish, how much has been enacted, and of course, so much remains to be done. But through another lens of trying to see how the world is demonstrating its ability to even consult, come together, reach consensus. These are milestones from that perspective. So when we think about then concretely the approaches to the pursuit of peace, what is the Baha'i international community actually doing? There are four areas we can look at. One is at the level of thought and at the level of ideas. So here it is sharing a new interpretive frame. So a frame by which to analyze, to understand, and to view the challenges before us. Some of the key threads that come through are a global orientation to issues and seeking to understand that no country really ever experiences challenges in isolation, and we need to seek to understand the role that the global community plays in each of these issues. A relational ontology, as I spoke about, the essential relationships making up the international social order, and then thinking about it again developmentally, kind of seeing humanity as it reaches new milestones and builds new capacities for collaboration. So in fact, what is beginning to emerge is a new epistemology of peace, one that involves, for example, as I mentioned, a global analysis, the question of agency, so being very explicit about who are the protagonists of change. Do we look to our governments? What is it that we look to our governments for? What is it that lies on the shoulder of communities themselves? What is it that lies on the shoulder of individuals? And then thinking about the shape of the new social order. So this redefinition, reconceptualization of relationships between individuals and communities and institutions. Of course, thinking about reconceptualizing power. And then we'll talk a little bit more about this question of collective deliberation, which again, this pivotal ability to deliberate together constructively, which the Baha'i community sees as really being at the heart, a really pivotal capacity of moving forward towards peace. And even concepts of justice and human rights, when looked at through the lens of the oneness of humanity, are seen as really reaching their highest expression in the context of being able to promote this unity of humankind. Further to the bottom left, another concrete contribution is being able to begin sharing insights from communities on the ground who are striving to apply some of these principles. So really just in a practical sense, trying to say, here are communities in very different socioeconomic, geopolitical contexts, trying to apply these principles. These are the fruits that they are seeing. So really understanding that we are all learning in our day-to-day lives and in our communities to try to live in a way that embodies some of these different principles. Further to the right is the building the capacity for collective action. On the one hand, the Baha'i community learning within itself to speak as one community, but also within the wider society. And this connects to the last point, fostering a culture of principled deliberation. One of the consistent and concrete contributions that the Baha'i international community has sought to make in its work at the UN is within the context of the many different committees and task forces that it's on, is paying attention to the culture of the conversation. Is this a conversation in which all of the needed actors are at the table? Is this a conversation which is dissolving into partisanship? Is this a conversation which is enabling us to reach consensus, to make decisions, to enact those decisions together? And so I think this very deliberate attention to the culture of deliberation and to the integrity of the conversation that is being had is reflected in the way that Baha'is are very often elected to or appointed to lead various task forces. And again, from a very pragmatic perspective, I think this underlines the fact that there's no lack of amazing, incredible cutting edge ideas within the chambers of the UN, but very much it's the culture and the manner in which we come together that becomes an obstacle for being able to translate those ideas into consensus or action. And one of the letters from the from the international governing body of the Baha'i faith, the Universal House of Justice, as it guides the work of the Baha'i international community, stated that, but whether through deeds or words, the merit of your, meaning the Baha'i communities, every contribution to social well-being lies first in your resolute commitment to discover that precious point of unity where contrasting perspectives overlap and around which contending peoples can coalesce. And finally, on the point of sort of the manner of engagement, I want to point to the quote on the right and the focus on learning as an orientation towards moving forward as a community. And here you see this quote cast within the context of the work on gender equality. And Bonnie Dougal, currently the principal representative of the Baha'is to the UN, notes that we must acknowledge that none of us, no group, no individual, no country, no leader actually knows what a society that is truly based on the principles of gender equality looks like. And here we can substitute gender equality for anything else. We have not achieved a perfect enactment of any of the UN ideals. And so she notes that such a society has never existed. And so therefore, while we may be able to identify some of the obstacles stymieing gender equality in our current paradigm, we actually have to learn our way towards a new paradigm where gender equality is the norm. And so this idea of, again, being in a developmental mind frame and understanding that we as communities around the world and as the international community are actually engaged in this intense process of learning, because we don't know what it means to perfectly implement any particular human rights. We don't know what a society with perfect gender equality looks like. And so again, there's a sense of like an evolutionary kind of organic process in which we are all learning together, making a lot of mistakes, but we're engaged in this common enterprise. So I want to finish by sharing a 2-minute excerpt from a film that was made on the 25th anniversary of the historic Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which emerged from the 1995 UN Fourth World Conference on Women. And this is a film which traces the movement towards women's human rights, in the context of enabling the flourishing of women. And it does so also by looking at, again, examples from communities on the ground and really trying to say, what does this look like at the level of the family and of the community? How are we learning to apply some of these principles that we believe are the pillars of peace on a global level? So I'm going to share a 2-minute excerpt from a group of village leaders in Malaysia who are talking about the mind, the shift and their orientation and understanding of what it means to think about women and girls differently in terms of their role in community life. So hopefully you can hear this.
Previously, according to our community culture and practices, men didn't really have trust in the capacity of the women in terms of their ability to contribute to opinions and knowledge. But gradually, women have shown their capacity and are now known as equal to men. Men are also gaining trust towards women. As village leaders, we have many responsibilities and are not only concerned with the education and religion of the villagers, but we are also concerned with the empowerment of women. Women are regarded as an important component of the community. This village will not develop further without women. Women help us to reach higher nobility.
Bermakna seluruh masyarakat dah mungkin pek naik oleh kerana mengkerdor ka bermakna kira bi meningkat lek kedudukan ji mai kampung.
I'm going to stop the video there. I do encourage those of you who are interested to look at the full film. It's a 30-minute film, which in a really interesting way tells the story of the movement and some examples of progress towards the ideals of gender equality, which have been kind of outlined by the UN, but really are being put into practice by thousands of organizations and hundreds of thousands of communities around the world. So again, so just to finish maybe with the questions that we started, as we think about reimagining modernity, what is the role of religion? So one of the insights that emerges from this research is really that, and from the research of others as well too, is that religious communities in many ways helps us to expand our moral imagination of what we see as possible and desirable in terms of the flourishing of humankind. Religious communities also demonstrate concretely alternative and unifying approaches to social change at all levels. The question of agency, who are the protagonists of the emerging social order, religious communities demonstrate they are not passive actors, simply absorbing the ideals of liberalism or capitalism wholesale as it exists in the current social order, but are co-creators of something new. Question being, the third question, what values will foster human flourishing? Here, I posit that one of the insights that comes out of the Baha'i International Community example is this reconceptualization of human identity, justice, peace, and collective action in light of movement towards the oneness of humanity. And then finally, from aspirations to action, how do we collectively translate ideals into action in continually changing circumstances? Is that we see from the example of the Baha'i community an orientation towards learning. In other words, experimenting, revising, reviewing, reflecting with a growing diversity of collaborators and partners as we learn what it means to work towards peace. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you, Julia, for this really interesting presentation. We'll have around 10 minutes now for Misbah, who is clapping. And Julia really deserves a round of applause. Yeah, Misbah, please go ahead. We'll give you 10 minutes max. So at 10 to 10, I think, in your part of the world, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, please try to keep it to the 10 minutes so that we also have a couple of minutes for discussion afterwards.
Sounds great. I'm also going to put a timer on just to make sure that I keep myself on time as well. But thank you so much for allowing me to, be a discussant here, and also to Julia. I mean, we met a couple of weeks ago and we talked about, the overlaps in our work and our theoretical interests, and just it's been such a rich experience. I have some written comments that I'm going to be reading from. And so I wanted to start by saying, just first of all, just as a very general comment of, in an academy that is dominated by Western and Christian frameworks, in which even the studies of traditions outside of Christianity are studied through the terms of orthodoxy, belief versus practice. For example, Dr. Julia Berger's generative book gives us hope to those of us entering into the academy, that it is possible to present conceptualizations of progress without resorting to Western liberal notions of development, or how to make sense of peace without resorting to war as the primary frame of reference. So this book was also such a joy to read. So I encourage everybody to try and get your hands on it. Dr. Berger's words really animated the page such that the reader could grasp very deep concepts with ease, but also read a bit of poetic wisdom along the way. So I'm going to read one excerpt from the end of chapter 6, just to illustrate exactly what I mean. She writes, the contribution of the BIC and of the National Assemblies, in addition to statements and the consultative processes, was the presentation of a community that, against all forces of disintegration and separation, has constituted itself as a diverse, unified entity. And this was the sentence that I particularly liked. It was a practical and living expression of the organizational substrate that oriented all efforts in the direction of fostering conditions for social cohesion, solidarity, and unity in diversity. So there's just a sort of simplicity in the language, but there's just a depth in what I think, what we can take from the writing. So it truly was a joy to read as well. Theoretically, Dr. Berger gives us 2 conceptual frameworks to engage with, at least within this one chapter, both of which are set within this new interpretive frame that she presents. One, she introduces this concept of the organizational substrate, a term that she drew from the biological sciences in order to sort of breathe the spirit of the community that she's studying into the theory that she is presenting. And something that I think we often lack when being bogged down within the academy of, jargon back and forth. And so there's this evolution within civilizational time, as she puts it, is how we're asked to conceptualize progress for the BIC, which cannot be in conflict with modernity because it's grown with modernity itself. Right. Secondly, she provides us with a conceptualization of peace built into the theology of the BIC, lesser peace and most great peace, the former being more akin to liberal notions of peace aimed at coexistence and cooperation among nation states. And the latter is denoting an inner spiritual peace that is, as Shoghi Effendi says, the practical consequence of the spiritualization of the world, right? So this does, or it can sort of take a linear-ish progression in form, but as Dr. Berger describes, it's unlike the theories of development that we might know in peace building and humanitarian literatures. It is instead more evolutionary, like a human being moving through stages of childhood through adolescence to adulthood, growing with the world around them. And oftentimes, as we all personally know and can attest to, with certain setbacks built into it, right? And so the progress might be evolutionary, but it would be a mistake to think of it as linear. And also, as we know today, the oneness of humanity is a goal that has had its own setbacks recently, despite previous periods when we thought we may have just been a bit closer. So again, while it takes an evolutionary process, the process itself by no means is linear. So I'll use the last half of my time to comment more specifically on why I chose to be here at 6 a.m. Pacific time, because I'm in California, to discuss this book. So I study the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, as was mentioned previously, which is also an international group that was birthed in the midst of modernity and has lived through persecution and resilience since its birth. In particular, conversations about religion as primordial and pre-modern have not gone away, especially in my own discipline of political science. We're still asking why Islam causes suicide terrorism. Yes, that was an article that was published only a few days ago. That has been my recent rant on Twitter. So it is especially important for scholars of religion to engage with communities that have been with modernity, right? How have the conditions of modern colonialism and the institutionalization of the nation state, for example, led to the creation of religious traditions, and how their conceptualizations of world peace are birthed and evolved through the conditions of our modern world, which I think is something that Dr. Berger and I are both sort of trying to contend with in our work. Within the Ahmadiyya, I study how the community's religious conceptualizations of peace actually maps onto liberal conceptions of peace building. So cooperation among nations, loyalty to country, nuclear disarmament, but it is rewritten through the central tenet that peace building requires a recognition of the creator. So when discussing loyalty to country, Ahmadis cite hadiths, they cite Quranic verses. So we're grappling with questions of how such groups are engaging with, rewriting, and as Dr. Berger tells us, co-creating the liberal order, rather than merely resisting it, which is often the assumption about religious groups. This is especially why I appreciate Dr. Berger's analytical focus on the UN, an institution that's closely associated with the liberal order, if not defined by the liberal order. And those wanting to study alternative conceptions of peace often locate themselves outside of the UN's institutional walls. And so in this book, she's directly engaging with the liberal order on their own terms and in their own location in order to illustrate the depth of how this very order is far more complicated than might be assumed by those who are within the order as well as those who set themselves outside of it. And then to illustrate some of the commonality in the sources that Dr. Berger and I have used in our work, an important book for the Ahmadiyya conceptualization of peace is actually a compilation of speeches and letters to world leaders from the head of the Ahmadiyya community, much like those letters written by the Baha'u'llah. So these communities in very explicit ways are speaking to leaders that we traditionally consider to be political actors, right? Allowing us to see how the separation between what is religious and what is political doesn't actually sustain itself in practice. Finally, since the study of these newer religious traditions, because the extent to which the Baha'i tradition is new, right, that takes on its own questions as well. Same thing for the Ahmadiyya, right, building from a larger and tradition. But even within religious studies, this is not as common, right? And so I sincerely and somewhat selfishly hope that we're able to recognize the intellectual depth that we can gain from studying traditions that are often thought of as in the margins of world's major religions, but actively participating in what is considered mainstream international politics, discourses, and institutions. So I want to end with this one sort of set of questions. So given your study's location of focus on the UN, the organizational substrate is alive through the institutional life of the BIC and the UN together. So at the beginning of the book, you mentioned, or throughout the book, actually, you mentioned the administrative order of the Baha'i system of governance as its third element. What might the organizational substrate look like in other locations of BIC practice? Within the Baha'i, like humanitarianism or other sorts of service projects, for example, how can we illustrate the organizational how can we illustrate the ways in which the organizational substrate breeds and evolves? Especially, how does the substrate allow for the Baha'i most great peace in the everyday practice of a Baha'i follower? So thank you so much once again. I know I'm just over my time, and this was such a joy to read, so thank you.
Thank you so much, Misbah. And don't worry, 1 minute over time, I think that's still acceptable. Yeah, Julia, I don't know, do you want to respond to any of the points that Misbah has made, or are you okay opening up now to the big group?
Yeah, maybe we can, first of all, thank you, Misbah, for those comments. I'm going to study them and rewatch the video because I want to make sure that I benefit from just your reflections and analysis. I think I will hold those questions, and they're brilliant questions. I don't think I have an answer to all of them either, but I would like to open it up to the group as well.
Okay, great. Thank you, Julia. We have 9 minutes left. Now is the time for all your questions, comments to either Julia or Misbah. They're all so impressed. They don't have anything to add.
Yes, I think everyone's having their morning coffee, especially the West Coasters. And I forgot it was 6 a.m. in California. So,
Misbah, yeah. Also, I was shocked to hear that you're in California. I didn't realize we could have moved the session to later in the day. Okay, so I see a hand. There is a hand up here. Mujan, do you want to go ahead? Do you want to ask your question or make your comment?
Yes, can you hear me okay? Okay. Both in the text that we were sent and also right at the beginning of this presentation, you spoke about a politics that's different from the politics that we're familiar with, and also a concept of religion different from the religion that we're familiar with. And you have, to a certain extent, described those in what you said, but I was wondering whether it's possible for you to give any more details about exactly how the Baha'is are producing a religion that's different from, in practical terms, what does it mean? And in practical terms, what does it mean to have a politics that's different from the politics that we're all familiar with? What does it mean at the sort of grassroots level?
Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that Dr. Mujan Momin is one of my great scholarly idols, and it's a little difficult to answer a question in the presence of someone who one has read so much and admires the work of. I wonder if I could hold that question and maybe have Stephen's question and then try to begin to answer some of the elements of those questions.
Hi, Julia. Thank you very much. This was a very timely sort of lecture. I'm actually writing an article now about the future of eschatology and just how it is going to be a factor in dealing with future sort of issues and so forth. So I don't really have a question for you, Julia, but what I want to do is just reach out in an email, because I think you're going to be a wealth of resources as I think about religious worldviews and how these paradigms that drive people, what is the future of these as we face conflict, climate change, and so many sort of challenges? And I think you would be, well placed based upon what I've read on your profile and from what I'm seeing with the Baha'i. So let me just reach out to you in an email.
Yeah, I would welcome that very much. That sounds That sounds wonderful. I'll look for your email. So I suppose that leaves me with Dr. Momin's wonderful question, which is at the heart of the book, which is trying to illustrate, again, in very concrete terms, what is this new conception of religion. And I think one of the ways, and I think this will take a long time to answer, but one way to think about it is, religion as an actor in history, religion as a response to the conditions of the world. One of the things that Baha'u'llah tells us is be anxiously concerned with the needs of the world ye live in and center your deliberations thereon. And so there is an element to being aware of and being present and being an actor in the very the very practical challenges that the world is facing, but doing it in a way that is contributing at the level of thought. When I talk about the epistemology of peace, I'm signaling the fact that that religion is a system of knowledge, not only a system of belief, that it introduces new categories, maybe as Foucault would say, new conditions of possibility are laid out before us. And so there are intellectual contributions being made, but there's also the contribution in the sense of generativity, of giving rise to a new community that is itself acting out, practicing those principles on the ground, in their homes, in their families, in their workplaces, out in the fields, in the village, in the town. So there's almost like this massive experimentation that's going on that is yielding insights into what does it mean for us to build peace, to work towards peace. And in that very kind of evolutionary sense, acknowledging that we are learning our way forward, that the Baha'i faith does not offer us a recipe, it does not offer us a blueprint, but rather there's a substrate, there's a framework, and that framework enables us to act and experiment according to a certain vision and principles. And then on the question of politics, I think, again, Misbah as a political scientist would be better able to answer this than a theologian and a person studying, from a religious studies background. But I think there's the question of, what work towards social change and transformation looks like, what shape and what form it takes, and really challenging the question of the political other. And do we need to have a conception of the other in order to move forward? What does it mean if we see ourselves as truly interdependent with all the communities in the world? What does that mean at the level of our deliberation and consultation? What does it mean at the level of identity? So really reconstructing our understanding of the human being, the political actor, as an actor, moving from a place of spiritual insight as well as intellectual insight. So just a very partial attempt at commenting on that question.
Right, thank you, Julia. Any other questions or comments? We have 2 minutes left, so we could take a teeny tiny question or comment. Really small one.
I see Dr. Momin has his hand up.
I'll give you a very small one. Why do you see so much intense opposition to the community from parts of the world, given the wonderfully positive image and history that you trace?
Because my dear colleague, Dr. Momin, is in the room, and he has written, I think maybe more than any other Baha'i about the persecution of Baha'is. Maybe I can leave the last minute to him if he could answer that very apropos question.
Well, 2 minutes is hardly enough to talk about that. I think that the main point to put across in terms of the sort of topics that we're talking about in this session is to say that the Baha'is in Iran, anyway, so the community that's being most persecuted in the world today, they haven't, there are various possibilities of responding to persecution. And what the way that the Baha'is in Iran have chosen to respond to persecution is that they have not just sort of sat back and complained about their persecutions, but they've actually responded in a positive way by trying to link up with other groups in Iran, other like-minded groups in Iran who are working towards positive change in society, whether it's to do with the equality of women and men, or whether it's to do education, or whether it's to do with the very poor elements of society, to act with them, to act with other groups in improving the immediate society around them, as a way of demonstrating that all the things that are being said about them by the government are not true. So I think that's just a small example that you could give for that.
Yeah, I think that there is, yeah, it's a complex question, and the second chapter in the book also focuses on the period of intense persecution between 1970 and 1986, and speaks to the response and to how the Baha'i community understands the nature of the persecution that is taking place.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for that. Time is up, unfortunately. Pretty sure we could spend some more time discussing this question, but we have other things to do, so we leave it at that for today. I hope you can join us again next month. If you would like to present yourself, or if you would like to be a respondent, or you know someone who would do a great job, then just be in touch and let us know about it, and we'd be happy to consider your suggestions. And on that note, have a good rest of your day or a nice evening, and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Nice to meet you
Bye,
all.
everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.